Picture this. It's late evening in an ancient city, and you're hungry. Not scrolling the fridge, hungry. The kind of hungry you feel after walking all day in worn sandals on dusty streets, with smoke in your hair and coins sweating in your palm. The sun is dropping behind tiled roofs. The air is thick with wood smoke and animals and people who have not discovered deodorant. And the question is the same as yours tonight. What's for dinner? And where do I get it fast? Look at this imagined street scene in front of you. Cramped houses leaning over a narrow lane, torchlight flickering on plaster walls. Somewhere a baby wails, somewhere a donkey objects to existence. But your eyes are drawn to the glow of a brazier and the bustle around it. That, my friend, is not a family kitchen. That is street food. Before refrigerators, supermarkets, and food delivery apps tried to domesticate our appetites, most ordinary people in cities survived on food cooked right there in the streets. Rome, the markets of imperial China, the labyrinth of stalls in Islamic cities, the rowdy fairs of medieval Europe, all of them fed their crowds with hot, cheap, sometimes questionable snacks. And here is the quiet, slightly alarming truth. If you were poor in many ancient cities, you probably didn't have a kitchen at all. Your restaurant row was the street corner, the bathhouse alley, the market gate. The people selling you food knew exactly how desperate, tired, and distracted you were, and they knew how to turn that into money. Imagine yourself in that crowd. Your stomach growls louder than the argument happening 2 stalls over. You're thinking less about nutrition and more about not fainting. The vendor watches you the way modern marketing teams watch your browsing history, with interest, with calculation, and with just enough charm to keep you coming back. In this journey, we're going to walk those streets together. We'll stop at a Roman thermopolium where wine is warmed and stews bubble. We'll elbow through Song dynasty markets at night under hanging lanterns. We'll get lost in the spice-scented alleys of Cairo and Damascus. We'll jostle through muddy European fairs where frying fat crackles like applause. Along the way, we'll ask a simple question with complicated answers. What did ordinary people really eat when they couldn't cook at home? And what did that food say about power, class, faith, and sheer survival? Keep that question in mind as we take our first real stop, the hungry, noisy, smoky streets of ancient Rome. Before we dive into exotic markets, let's start with something surprisingly familiar, the Roman housing crisis. Picture a painted fresco of a tall, slightly crooked apartment block, an insula, cracked plaster, laundry flapping from tiny balconies, a cat claiming a roof tile as its throne. Down on the ground floor, painted counters and big stone jars. Above, a stack of cramped rooms without chimneys or ovens. If you were a poor Roman, your kitchen was probably a small brazier and a window you hoped the smoke would find. Landlords hated fire. Fire meant lawsuits, repairs, angry neighbors, maybe the emperor's attention, never good news. So for safety and profit, cooking was pushed out of fragile upper floors and onto the streets. Enter the thermopolium, a street bar for the hungry, not the thirsty, though there was plenty of cheap wine doing its best. Imagine the camera panning along a Roman street at midday. Wheel ruts in the dust, vendors shouting prices, the clatter of metal against ceramic. You stop at a counter with round holes, each holding a jar of something steaming. Lentil stew, chickpeas, bits of pork if you're lucky, yesterday's fish if you're not. The air is a cocktail of garlic, smoke, vinegar, and humanity. Behind the counter stands the owner, Lucius, sweating in the heat. He knows his regulars, the dock worker who always asks for more bread, the tired widow counting each coin twice, the young clerk who pretends he's above street food but comes every afternoon anyway. Lucius tells himself he's just feeding people, but he also knows that if he waters the wine a little more and stretches the stew with another ladle of barley, he might finally pay off his debts this month. Not everyone loves men like Lucius. Somewhere in a quieter villa, a moralizing writer is complaining that the streets stink of fried food and bad wine, that the lower classes are noisy, greedy, always eating instead of working. City officials worry too. Stalls block traffic, smoke blackens new public buildings, and if someone gets sick after a bowl of dubious fish stew, angry crowds suddenly remember who gave the vendor his license. The tension sits there between pot and purse. How close can he dance to cheating before his customers stop trusting him? How much can they taste under the salt, the herbs, the gossip? Tonight, one particular dish ladled from those jars will carry us deeper into Rome's stomach and into the quiet anxieties simmering under its empire-wide appetite. Lean closer to that painted counter. In the still image, you can almost see the steam clouding the air, blurring the faces of the customers. Lucius is stirring a pot of pulse, a thick barley porridge, the Roman equivalent of "it will fill you up, stop complaining." He ladles it into cheap bowls, then spoons over a bit of vegetable stew, maybe a shred of salty pork for the man who tipped him yesterday. On a shelf behind him sit clay jugs of wine, already fortified with what can only be described as optimistic herbs. A side pan sizzles with sausages made from whatever trimmings the butcher could not respectably sell. A bowl of olives glistens in oil. Near it, a jar of garum, the famous fermented fish sauce, waiting to transform bland into powerful or catastrophic, depending on the nose. Lucius' inner monologue is simple. Keep the line moving, keep the pots just hot enough to look safe, and keep the smell good enough that no one asks what was cooked in that pot yesterday. He glances at a young woman hesitating by the door, clutching a coin. Is she going to try to haggle? Is she about to complain? One sharp comment could turn the lunchtime mood against him. From the street, you would hear overlapping rhythms. The scrape of wooden spoons, the slap of bread loaves torn by hand, the distant roar of a cart on cobblestones. Over it all, the sing-song patter of vendors promising that their stew is hotter, fresher, more generous than the stall next door. The PR battle for your stomach started long before commercials. But there's a darker layer to the scene. Some customers eye the food suspiciously, sniffing for signs that yesterday's leftovers have been revived once too often. A city inspector might appear at any time, frowning at the drains, pretending that regulations exist for public health rather than bribes. Lucius tells himself he's honest enough, but he also knows that if the pots cool or the line shifts to another doorway, his children will go hungry long before his patrons do. And when night falls, another kind of customer appears: drunk soldiers, gamblers from the taverns, women who trade favors in alley shadows. The food has to be hearty enough to soak up wine and cheap enough that no one remembers the taste in the morning. Lucius wonders how long he can work these hours before his body gives out. For now, though, the bowls are selling and coins are clinking into his wooden box. Still, as dusk approaches and the air grows thicker, the Roman appetite will change. What happens to street food when the sun goes down, and when we leave Rome for another empire's night market? Shift the map east. Our next still image is a painted scroll from Song Dynasty China, a bustling riverside city, maybe Kaifeng or Hangzhou. At first glance, it looks almost modern. Bridges arch over the water, boats nose toward the banks, and along the streets a dense forest of shop signs hangs like vertical flags. Look closely at one corner of the painting. There's a stall under a canvas awning, lanterns hanging like small moons. Steam rises from a cauldron. Beside it, neat stacks of bowls, chopsticks laid out with practiced care. The ground is muddy, but the food looks clean, almost elegant. Here, street food has become an art form. The vendor, let's call her May, ladles out noodle soup as fast as hands appear. She knows the rhythms of the city. Clerks from the government offices rush past at noon. Scholars linger late arguing about poetry. Porters stomp in with sore shoulders and hollow stomachs. May's inner calculation is not so different from Lucius. How to keep the broth rich but affordable. How to smile enough that people come back. How to stay invisible enough that officials don't decide her stall is suddenly illegal. Because here's the tension. In many Chinese cities, there were curfews and regulations about night markets. Officials worried that late-night eating led to gambling, crime, and, worst of all, unsupervised fun. Yet the demand for hot food after dark never stopped. So the same government that frowned on disorder quietly relied on people like May to keep workers fed, soldiers content, and travelers impressed. Imagine standing at her stall at dusk. The lantern light stains the steam gold, and you hear the slap of noodles hitting hot broth, the clink of coins on the counter, the murmur of gossip about tax increases and border troubles. The scent is a layered thing, soy and ginger, a whisper of sesame oil, and underneath it all the river's damp breath. It feels uncannily like a modern night market, except the phones are replaced by bamboo tallies and memory. Somewhere nearby, a night watchman beats a wooden clapper, reminding everyone of the official curfew. May pretends not to hear. She is weighing, in the space of a heartbeat, whether to close early and lose money or risk a fine to serve the hungry queue snaking into the darkness. For the moment, hunger wins over fear. She reaches for another bundle of dough, stretches it into long, thin strands, and drops them into the pot. What exactly ends up in those bowls, and how far people will bend rules to get it, will tell us a lot about how empires actually run after sunset. Let the imaginary camera follow May's customers as they drift deeper into the night market. Lanterns multiply, turning the street into a glowing tunnel. Stalls line both sides, one piling steamed buns in bamboo towers, another twisting dough into rings and dropping them into oil, another grilling skewers that hiss and spit tiny comets of fat into the dark. On the right, a man with ink-stained fingers stands awkwardly with his bowl, a minor official, a little overdressed for this crowd. He tells himself he is here to observe the people, but really he wanted an excuse to escape the bland respectability of his household dinner. Each slurp of maize broth comes with a flicker of guilt. If his colleagues saw him here, slurping like a porter, would they think less of him? Or secretly envy him? Street food, in this city, is a social blender. Under the awnings you find boatmen, widows, students cramming for exams, merchants boasting about profits, a courier halfway through a 3-day ride. They stand side by side, trading jokes and complaints between bites. In the still image you can see it clearly. Silk sleeves brushing cheap hemp, embroidered shoes perilously close to puddles. The smells tangle together, star anise, frying oil, scallions, sugar melting into glossy candied fruits on skewers. Somewhere, a vendor pours hot tea from a long-spouted kettle in a theatrically high arc, not for showy tourists but to rinse away the day's fatigue. It is chaotic, but not random. Every shout and sizzling pan fits a pattern built from centuries of habit. But the market also shows the city's fault lines. Prices creep up during bad harvests. Vendors quietly thin the fillings of dumplings, replacing pork with more cabbage and hope. May lies awake on her straw mat at night, doing arithmetic in her head. If flour costs this much, and firewood that much, how many bowls does she have to sell just to stay exactly as poor as she is now? Somewhere in a government office, the ink-stained official writes a report praising the prosperity of the city, the abundance of commerce, the liveliness of the streets. He leaves out the part where he bought a second bowl because the first one made him briefly forget his career anxieties. For now, the night market thrums on, a heartbeat you can almost hear through the scroll. Yet outside China, other cities are discovering their own taste for crowded alleys, sizzling pans, and the politics of feeding strangers. To see how food, faith, and trade collide, we need to turn our gaze toward the great Islamic cities of the medieval world. Now picture a different map altogether. The Islamic world at its height, dotted with cities like Jules, Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo. Our still image focuses on a narrow lane of a suq, the covered market. Light spills through latticework above, striping the air with brightness and shadow like bars on a birdcage. To your left, a baker pulls flatbreads from a domed oven, stacking them in a high, wobbling tower. The edges blistered, the centers soft, they steam in the cool shade. To your right, a man fans a charcoal grill, skewers of lamb and onion smoke like offerings. Somewhere ahead, someone is frying balls of spiced chickpea dough until they crackle, then drowning them in tahini. This is a food court before food courts, and it runs on more than hunger. The kebab seller, call him Yusuf, is acutely aware that he operates in a city where charity is a religious obligation and reputation matters as much as flavor. He slips an extra piece of meat into the bread of a poor scholar he recognizes, not just from kindness, but because he knows people are watching. Feed the poor is a moral duty, but it is also very good public relations. At the same time, Yusuf fights quieter fears. Meat is expensive, spices more so. If he's too generous, he risks falling behind on the rent for his tiny stall. If he's too stingy, customers drift to the competitor 2 arches down, where a cousin of a judge has invested in an aggressively fragrant new spice blend. He wakes every dawn with the same calculation in his head, half prayer, half spreadsheet. The suq itself is a sensory onslaught. You hear the call to prayer rising above bargaining voices, the ring of a brass ladle against a pot of lentils, the rustle of silk being folded behind a neighboring counter. You smell cinnamon, grilled fat, mint, sweat, leather, animal dung, and dust. In a still photograph, you would see faces from 3 continents, thanks to trade routes that bring both cinnamon sticks and wide-eyed visitors. Yet these stalls are more than background color. They feed caravans, scholars, pilgrims on their way to holy sites, soldiers passing through between campaigns. What happens when drought, war, or plague interrupts that steady flow of people and grain will hit this alley long before it reaches the palaces. And one day, Yusuf will have to decide whether to water the stew, cheat the waits, or close his stall entirely. The choices he makes, and the rules the city imposes on men like him, will echo unexpectedly when Europe's own chaotic fairs begin to copy, adapt, and fear the power of food sold to strangers. Freeze the frame on a different figure in that same suq. A man in a neat robe, beard carefully trimmed, accompanied by 2 assistants. He is the mutasib, the market inspector, responsible for order, fair prices, and at least the appearance of hygiene. In a painting, he would look serene. Inside, he is doing mental gymnastics worthy of a modern health inspector with a political appointment. He watches Yusuf flip skewers and glances at the scales. Are they accurate? Is the meat fresh? Is the oil too old, darkened by dozens of batches of chickpea fritters? The mutasib knows that if he starts closing popular stalls, the public will grumble that he is killing livelihoods. If he does nothing and people fall ill, they will mutter that he has failed in his duty before God. Street food, in this world, is constantly negotiated between appetite, morality, and municipal anxiety. Some cities establish soup kitchens or bread distributions for the poor. Others leave charity to private donors, who might fund big communal cauldrons of stew during Ramadan. A chronic tension hums beneath the surface. Should feeding the hungry be spontaneous generosity or carefully managed policy? Imagine a still image of a long table set up in a mosque courtyard, bowls lined like helmets, a massive pot in the background. The aroma is rich: lamb, grains, spices. The donors stand slightly to the side, trying to look modest, but hoping someone notices their contribution. The mutasib hovers nearby, counting loaves and calculating whether this generosity will raise expectations he can't enforce tomorrow. Our inspector walks home through twilight streets, passing oil lamps and shuttered stalls. He is replaying the day. The vendor he warned for watering the milk, the baker whose bread was suspiciously light, the whispered complaint from a widow who can no longer afford even a bowl of lentils. He believes in justice, but he also knows the city's grain stores are not infinite, and the next caravan is late. Meanwhile, far to the northwest, other cities are improvising their own way of feeding crowds. No covered suqs there. Instead, muddy open spaces, temporary wooden stalls, and fairs that appear like pop-up festivals. You can almost hear the coarse laughter, the crack of tankards, the roar of animals, the sizzle of fat in iron pans over open fires. As Europe slowly drags itself out of the early Middle Ages, its street food will reveal different fears and different opportunities for those bold enough to fry in public. Shift again, this time to a muddy field on the edge of a European town, 13th century or so. The fair has come to town, and for a few weeks this quiet place is the center of the universe. Imagine a woodcut, tents like crooked teeth, wagons pulled into rough circles, a forest of poles flying ragged banners. In the background, a stone church watches suspiciously from a hill. Follow your eyes to the food stalls. A spit turns slowly, dripping fat from a small pig over the fire. A woman pours batter onto a hot iron plate, lifting off thin cakes that might be today's nearest thing to pancakes. Another vendor sells meat pies, their crusts golden, their fillings a mystery only vaguely related to what the sign promises. One of those vendors, call her Agnes, is a widow from a nearby village. She has borrowed money to buy flour and lard, and the look in her eyes is the look of someone gambling her next 6 months on the smell of frying dough. If she sells out, she can pay her landlord and maybe have a little left to hide in a jar. If rain or gossip or a bad batch of oil ruins the fair, she will go home to a winter of excuses and thin soup. The fair smells wildly alive. Wood smoke, spilled ale, horse sweat, frying onions, damp wool, wet earth. You hear minstrels, the clatter of dice, merchants arguing over cloth prices, children shrieking with sugar rush. Churchmen preach against sin just a few stalls away from vendors happily selling the things that encourage it. It is, in short, a medieval version of Las Vegas, with worse dentistry. Street food here blurs the line between necessity and indulgence. Most peasants live on porridge, coarse bread, maybe a bit of cured pork when the stars align. At the fair they can taste things usually reserved for the better off. Spiced wine, sweet pastries, sausages that contain, for once, more meat than imagination. Agnes knows this. She sprinkles a little sugar, pours a little extra fat, not because it's healthy, but because this is their one chance to feel rich. Yet in the background lurks a risk that no one fully understands. The way bad meat, dirty hands, and crowded bodies can create invisible threads of sickness. A barrel of dubious shellfish, a pie kept one day too long in the sun, a jug of water drawn downstream from the latrines. Any of these could turn a treat into a weapon. As dusk falls and torches flare, the fair's pleasures intensify, and so do the chances that tomorrow's complaints will not be about prices, but about pain. By now you may have noticed a pattern. Wherever people crowd together without refrigerators, street food appears like mushrooms after rain, and with it, a constant background hum of anxiety. Fire, filth, fraud, illness, the four horsemen of the urban snack. Take a composite image, a Roman edict carved on stone warning against blocking streets with stalls, a Chinese notice about curfew, an Islamic legal text on proper weights and measures, a European town ordinance setting where butchers may dump their offal. Different scripts, same headaches. City leaders want the bustle and tax revenue of street food, but not the fires and food poisoning that occasionally follow. Imagine a physician in a long robe. We could name him Marcus, or Ibn something, or Master Jean, walking through the market with a handkerchief pressed to his nose. He has noticed that after big festivals, the sickbeds fill up. He suspects the food, or perhaps the bad air, or maybe the position of the planets. His theories are shaky, but his unease is solid. When he passes a stall selling pale sausages in warm weather, his stomach tightens for reasons that have nothing to do with appetite. At night, he sits by candlelight, quill hovering over a half-filled notebook. He sketches little tables, noting dates of feasts, weather, types of foods eaten, kinds of illness afterward. It is not quite epidemiology, but it is more than superstition. The thought nags at him. Could you make crowds safer without killing the joy that draws them out of their cramped homes in the first place? Regulations creep in. Fires must be kept away from wooden balconies. Fish may not be sold after certain hours. Bread weights are checked with official stones. Inspectors poke, measure, and occasionally theatrically throw bad goods into the gutter for the public's reassurance. Vendors roll their eyes and go back to stretching the rules where no one is looking. Yet whenever something truly terrible happens, a citywide fire, a bout of bloody flux, later on the arrival of plague, the suspicion falls quickly on the most visible targets: crowded markets, noisy taverns, street food sellers whose very success makes them easy to blame. Moralists mutter that God is punishing gluttony. Practical people quietly wish someone would just install better drains. This is the moment when our story's stakes rise. Because soon, in more than one part of the world, disaster will hit hard enough that it forces permanent changes in how cities eat, cook, and try to control the humble food stall. To see that turning point, we have to watch a city burn and another one drown in invisible contagion. For our first disaster, let's jump ahead in time to a city you probably know better. London, 17th century, built mostly of wood and wishful thinking. Imagine an engraving. Tightly packed houses leaning over narrow lanes, upper stories almost touching, signs creaking above the heads of pedestrians. In the foreground, a bakehouse with a brick oven glowing like an open wound. We don't need to replay the entire Great Fire. You know how that story goes. What matters for our tale is the moment afterward, when the smoke clears and the city's leaders stand in the ashes trying to decide what, exactly, they will blame. It is very tempting to point at open flames, street cooking, tiny ovens tucked into wooden buildings, and declare, never again. Picture a weary city official, soot still clinging to his hair, staring at a rough plan of the ruined streets. His own house is gone, his friends' shops are rubble, and yet he has to think like an engineer and a politician. Does he ban bakehouses from the center? Does he push cooking into brick structures, separate from where people sleep? Every decision means winners, losers, and lobbyists with very good wine. Meanwhile, vendors like Agnes' great-great-grandchildren stand among the ruins wondering if there will be any place for them in the new, safer, more regulated city. A little grill on a corner seems harmless until someone with a quill and a memory of flames decides otherwise. The smell of roasting meat, once a comforting sign of normal life, now also carries a hint of guilt. Out of scenes like this, in London and countless less famous fires elsewhere, comes an important shift. The idea that cooking in crowded cities must be controlled, compartmentalized, boxed in by bricks and laws. Street food survives because hunger is stubborn, but its streets narrow. Vendors are pushed to certain markets, certain hours, certain types of fuel. The irony, of course, is that people still cram into wooden theaters, churches, and taverns with candles everywhere. Yet in the public imagination, the dangerous flame is the one under the poor woman's pan. As rebuilding begins and new building codes are drawn, another invisible fire is already smoldering in city alleys. The slow burn of disease born from water and waste rather than sparks, a threat that will make even the cleanest-looking cup of street corner refreshment suspect. Soon, a bowl of soup or a shared jug of water will carry fears far beyond simple indigestion, and the relationship between ordinary people and the food sold on their streets will change again, this time under the shadow of pandemics rather than smoke. Plague is not picky about where you bought your lunch. Still, when waves of epidemic disease roll through cities, markets and food stalls become part of the story simply because they are where bodies cluster, breathe, and share things they shouldn't. Picture a late medieval town during the Black Death. Narrow streets strangely quiet, shutters closed, a cart trundling by with a driver who doesn't meet anyone's eye. The marketplace that once rang with cries of vendors now hosts only a few stubborn stalls. A woman selling hot pottage stirs her cauldron with a face like carved wood, watching the thinning crowd with mounting dread. Her inner argument is brutal. If she closes, there is no savings account, no government support. Her children will eat cold scraps until those run out. If she stays, she stands in the middle of whatever invisible poison is felling her neighbors. Rumors whisper that bad smells cause the sickness. Others say it's foreigners, or sin, or the alignment of planets. Almost no one blames the rats. No one has invented a word like bacteria yet, but fear doesn't need vocabulary. In some places, authorities order markets moved outside city walls, hoping fresh air will help. In others, days of fasting are declared, which is rough on people already living close to the edge of hunger. Street vendors find themselves shut out for public health, while nobles still enjoy private feasts behind manor walls. The lesson is not lost on anyone paying attention. Disease, like food, is filtered through class. Fast forward a few centuries to the era before modern refrigeration, when cholera begins stalking industrial cities. Look at a lithograph of a crowded 19th century street. Tenements towering over gutters where children splash in water that also carries every kind of filth. A man sells cups of cool well water from a barrel. On a hot day, he might as well be selling life itself. He doesn't know that some wells are death in a bucket. Out of these horrors come new obsessions. Boiling water, baking bread thoroughly, regulating slaughterhouses, separating drinking water from waste. Street food vendors are told to clean more, to move, to submit to inspections. Some adapt, some vanish. And in at least one great empire, a simple, steaming drink will quietly revolutionize what safe street food even means, because when the water for your snack is always boiled, your odds of surviving dinner go up dramatically. Follow that trail of rising steam, and we find ourselves back in East Asia and, eventually, in tea houses and stalls that serve security in a cup alongside noodles on the side. Steam, it turns out, is a pretty good bodyguard. Long before germ theory, people in different cultures noticed that those who drank boiled beverages seemed to fare a little better. In China and neighboring regions, tea had already become a daily habit. In bustling cities, tea houses doubled as snack hubs, their kettles singing almost non-stop. Picture a late imperial street in a Chinese city. Wooden signboards, tiled roofs, a tea house door flung open to show rows of customers on benches. On the wall hang painted menus listing noodles, dumplings, steamed buns. A boy weaves through the crowd with a kettle, topping up cups. In a corner, a traveler from another province sits hunched over his bowl, savoring both the warmth and the feeling that, for a few minutes, he belongs. His inner calculation is simple but profound. Here, he can eat without lighting a fire, drink without drawing from a dubious well. The same logic someday will make coffee stalls and soup kitchens a feature of other cities. But in this scene, it is tea that quietly cuts the risk of disease. No one calls it public health. They call it hospitality, or maybe just habit. At the same time, new ingredients are flowing along trade routes that knit together our scattered markets. Imagine a map with arrows, chilies from the Americas lighting up Asian and Middle Eastern stews, tomatoes slipping into Mediterranean street snacks, maize and potatoes reshaping what cheap filling food looks like in Europe. Street vendors are early adopters, not because they read culinary trend reports, but because they feel in their palms what sells fastest. In an Ottoman city, a seller sprinkles newly fashionable spices onto grilled meat to tempt passers-by. In a European port, a woman experiments with frying potatoes in fat and discovers a line forms faster at her stall than at the bread only one next door. She doesn't care where the potato came from. She cares that it keeps bellies quiet for a few hours. By now, our story's turning point is clear. Street food is no longer just a local solution to local hunger. It has become a global mesh of ideas, ingredients, and improvised technologies, kettles, grills, portable ovens, that keep ordinary people alive and occasionally delighted. And just over the horizon, another invention will begin to upend this whole ecosystem. The ability to make cold on demand, to store food for days instead of hours, and to move eating out of necessity and into the realm of choice. Before we open the refrigerator door, though, we should glance one more time at the streets on the eve of that change and listen to what the vendors themselves fear and hope will happen next. Imagine a sepia photograph of a big industrial city around 1900. Horses and early trams share the streets. Soot grays the sky. Advertisements shout from brick walls in chunky letters. On a busy corner, a cluster of street carts forms a kind of improvised island. One selling hot chestnuts, another oysters on the half shell, another thick slices of bread with something mysterious and salty on top. Behind one of those carts stands a man in a flat cap. We'll call him Thomas, with a small charcoal stove built into the wooden frame. He has been here for 20 years, watching the neighborhood change around him. Where there were once cramped tenements, there is now a grand department store with its own cafe. Where his customers once paid in pennies after long shifts in nearby factories, some now earn enough to sit indoors, order from a printed menu, and feel, for half an hour, like the people in the advertisements. Thomas's inner monologue is an uneasy mix of pride and dread. He knows the regular who still comes every morning for a hot roll because habit is stronger than salary. He also watches others drift away, drawn by the novelty of tiled floors, white tablecloths, and food that arrives from a hidden kitchen rather than a pan in the open air. Worse, he has heard rumors of something called cold storage, making it possible to keep fish and meat much longer, somewhere out of sight. The street still has its own powerful appeal. In the photograph, you can almost smell the chestnut's sweet char, the brine of oysters, the sharp tang of pickles sold from open barrels. Children tug at their parents' sleeves, eyes fixed on the bright, forbidden promise of candied apples or hot chips. Workers on short breaks choose speed over ceremony, swallowing their lunch in a few hungry bites with the wind in their faces. But a shift is underway, as iceboxes and early refrigerators creep into wealthier homes, and as large suppliers gain the ability to move chilled goods long distances, daily dependence on the nearest vendor begins to loosen. Street food starts to slide, in some neighborhoods, from how we survive toward what we grab when we're in a hurry or feel nostalgic. Thomas feels it, even if he couldn't explain it in economic terms. standing in the cold, hands warmed over the same little stove his father used. He wonders whether his grandchildren will still work in the street, or whether their customers will be at home, peering into a glowing, humming box to decide what to eat. To find out, we need to step through that kitchen door and then, carefully, back out onto the pavement again. So here we are, finally, in the age of humming refrigerators and supermarkets bright enough to perform surgery in. The question is, what did all of this do to the world we've been walking through? That smoky trail from Lucius Thermopolium to May's night market to Yusuf's suq and Agnes Fair. Picture a modern kitchen in a modest apartment. White fridge humming, freezer stacked with boxes, shelves lined with cans, and jars whose labels promise immortality. A middle-aged office worker, maybe not unlike you, opens the door, stares at the well-lit abundance, and sighs. There's nothing to eat. The irony would not be lost on a Roman dockworker who lived on street stew and whatever bread Lucius had left. Our modern eaters' inner conflict is different, but strangely familiar. They have food, but not time. They have options, but not appetite for planning. So on the way home, they stop at a food truck or a corner stand. Tacos, noodles, kebabs, whatever the local vocabulary of comfort happens to be. They tell themselves it's a treat, not a necessity. But in that moment, the street has reclaimed its old role. Fast, hot, social, faintly risky, and oddly honest. Supermarkets and fridges move the center of gravity for food into the home, especially in wealthier societies. Yet street food never quite disappeared. In some places it became snack culture for people who could technically cook but would prefer not to. In others, dense cities, poorer neighborhoods, parts of the global south, it remains what it has always been, the primary kitchen for people without space, fuel, or stable jobs. If you freeze-frame a global montage, you'll see echoes everywhere. A vendor in Cairo today, selling falafel from a cart, would recognize Yusuf's calculations. A Bangkok noodle seller working beside a roaring road shares May's worry about curfews and inspections. A hot dog cart near a stadium on a winter night faces Thomas's mix of gratitude and unease as customers come and go with each economic wave. You can almost feel the heat from the griddle, smell the onions, hear the low murmur of people waiting with their hands jammed in their pockets against the cold. The fridge did not kill street food. It changed the reasons we use it. And understanding those reasons, hunger, hurry, loneliness, curiosity, the sheer joy of eating something hot in the cold, is the last step toward answering our opening question. One more chapter, and we'll see what all those pots and pans, from Rome to right now, have really been cooking up. Let's gather everyone one last time, as if we could line them up along a single, impossible street. On one side, Lucius at his Roman counter, ladle poised over barley stew. Next to him, May with her noodles and lanterns. Then Yusuf by his grill in the suq's cool shade, Agnes with her fairground pan, the Mutasib frowning thoughtfully, Thomas with his chestnuts, and a modern food truck barista juggling espresso shots. Freeze that imaginary group portrait. What did ordinary people really eat from these hands in the long ages before fridges and supermarkets? Mostly, the answer is wonderfully unglamorous. Grains turned into porridge and bread, beans and lentils, cabbage and onions, small scraps of meat when luck or wages allowed. Broths and stews that could be stretched with water, buns and dumplings that hid how little filling there really was. The magic wasn't in rare ingredients. It was in what hunger and ingenuity did with them. Vendors learned how long they could keep food warm without killing their customers, how much spice it took to make yesterday's meat taste like today's blessing, how to place a stall where the wind carried the smell directly into the path of the tired and the tempted. Their inner monologues were not about street food culture, but about rent, children, debts, gossip, survival. For customers, the street meal answered more than, "What's for dinner?" It offered a break from crowded homes, a place to overhear news, to flirt a little, to feel the city breathing around them. A bowl of stew or a skewer from a cart was cheaper than a theater ticket and came with better aromas. It was a way to belong to a place without owning any piece of it. Picture a slow pan across their faces, Lucius counting coins with stained fingers, May watching the steam to judge when the broth is right, Yusuf listening for praise he will pretend not to hear, Agnes wincing at each cloud on the horizon. The Mutasib wondering if justice and mercy can share the same set of scales. Thomas feeling the heat on his cheeks while the city's cold wind claws at his back. Each of them is asking, in their own way, will this be enough? Today, when you unwrap something from a paper sleeve on a busy corner, you are taking part in that same quiet drama. You are trusting a stranger with your stomach. They are trusting you to make their day's work worth it. The details have changed, the health codes, the ingredients, the background hum of traffic instead of hooves, but the basic deal is ancient. So next time you pass a stall or a cart and catch a whiff of garlic, charcoal, sugar, or spice, you can imagine the ghosts of all those past diners standing beside you, coins in hand, arguing with themselves about whether they can really afford this treat. And maybe, just for a moment, the street around you will look a little older and a little more human.